and caring for the planet, which, are interconnected. So we're really, really happy you're here. While we're waiting for everyone to join, if you want to put your name in the chat and where you're coming in from, just so we have a sense of who's coming and who's here and where you're coming in from, and connect to each other because we have amazing guests today and a lot to cover. The Cold War, big subject. So please put your name in there and where you're from. So here we are. We're in Disarm the Earth Month, April, as we lead up to Earth Day. And our agenda for the next hour, I said, is really packed. And there's, a lot to understand about the Cold War and how it's being driven. And at the edge of the Cold War is this use of nuclear weapons that is the ultimate climate change. And so, the worst thing is that we have people in the US government who talk about winning a nuclear war, which is insane. But we know that, yeah, insanity seems to be going around. We have today for you Anlin Wang, who's going to talk about China, our amazing Anne Wright, who's going to talk about Ukraine and Iran, um, Henry, who is part of our China's Not Our Enemy team, Henry Nichols, but also brought us the whole idea of the peace clock, which is where instead of paying attention to the doomsday clock that's taking us to doom, what is it that we each can be doing to move that that clock arm back towards peace and be more engaged instead of just, watching doom happen. And then we have the huge gift of Vijay Prashad ending, who, has No Cold War, the project that is global, to kind of give us an overview around the Cold War and the planet. So that's what's in store for you ahead. And this is our third in a series, and I'm going to turn you over to Aaron, who will, set us up and the campaign that he runs at Code Pink. War is not green. Take it away, Aaron.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with everyone. And if this is your third time with us this month, or even more if you've been going to some other events, welcome back. And if not, welcome to this space. It's really exciting to be here and I think really urgent, of course. So I'm going to start the stage a little bit by talking about where we are, uh, by talking about where we're coming from within the scope of this series that we've been going throughout Earth Month. We started out the month by talking about land in the context of war and ecocide and imperialism and what that's done to local ecosystems and the connection to that globally. We learned about sort of the extraction that drives destruction to land and to people. In Palestine, the ecocide or the total destruction of the natural environment, which is not just there and an impact of the genocide, is not just sort of an unfortunate side effect, but ecocide in Palestine is a tactic of genocide, and it's something also that's been inflicted to all of the land for the past 75 plus years, with the planting of non-native pine trees throughout the land and settlers taking different forms of the land. We also, in that first webinar, talked a little bit about the Philippines and the extraction of minerals, the Philippines being sort of a quote unquote strategic place, both for labor and for sort of imperialist presence. Uh, a lot of that has been incredibly destructive to the land. It's such an agricultural society, and so much military presence and training drills are there. And it's now, of course, being used as a proxy and has been used as a proxy for US escalation with China, which we'll talk a lot more about tonight. We also, in that first webinar, talked a lot about the Congo and the extractive interest there through the rare minerals that have been part of the sort of Western presence in the Congo for decades. A lot of that often started, and you can learn a lot about this if you watch Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which I recommend that you all do. But it's a lot of that started through the mining of uranium, which was part of a nuclear buildup and the start of that was part of the original Cold War that launched a lot of the interests that we're sort of talking about. And so when we think about nuclearization, that's something that's going to remain a bit of a shadow over sort of a lot of different aspects of our discussion tonight, even when it's not sort of the centerpiece of it, which is, why it's part of the title, this being about nuclearization and the new Cold War. And so when we think about the destruction that nuclear weapons cause, many of us, might think about the horrific war crimes when the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan during World War II. And of course, nuclear weapons absolutely decimate any environment that they're in, so many lasting health impacts. And of course, with any even further escalation with retaliatory strikes, there's the possibility of a global nuclear winter that will affect, of course, life and agriculture or everywhere, in addition to the initial insanity of what they can unleash locally. And so, it's terrifying when we're even talking about it in the context of the war in Ukraine or anything else or any other forms of escalation. And so, yeah, and I think also if you're thinking about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, I also encourage folks to look up Hidankyo, which is an organization of survivors that's talked a lot about this as well. But the buildup and possession of them from the Congo and uranium mining and transports through indigenous lands throughout the so-called US and have been part of dynamics of land grabs that are really at the core of imperialism, of extraction in every possible meaning of that word. And so also you have when countries like Israel have nuclear weapons, it allows them to commit genocide and creates a bit of an untouchable character of it. And so when we want to look at the dynamics of what escalates the world into the future, that we're even talking about the use of them and the destruction that the buildup and that the war making and escalation around the world causes to local landscapes, to the global landscape, we need to talk about those dynamics. And so tonight we'll look a little bit more about what prompts what we talked about in the last webinar that we did, which was the over 800 toxic military bases around the world. And a lot of that is being prompted by global escalation and new Cold War dynamics. This, of course, leads into conversation around escalation with China, Iran, the Ukraine proxy war. And so this campaign this is about the series that we're sort of creating tonight, Disarming Earth Day, is about sort of both disrupting the traditional notions of what Earth Day looks like, with weapons manufacturers sponsoring science events or climate areas that don't sort of even touch the idea of war making. And it's also prompting a call to action in terms of the ways that we can truly save the Earth and the people on it and our reciprocal relationship to the land, which is we need to be disarming the US and Western imperialism. We need to be ending war. We need to be creating peace through liberation. And so often, unfortunately, and this is what a lot of the War is Not Green campaign is talking about in climate spaces, the elephant in the room is the US military, which is the world's #1 institutional polluter. It would be the 47th largest emitting country if it were one. And of course, the forestry, the biodiversity, the land grabs, the forced displacement that the US military causes throughout the world are insanely destructive to it. And so tonight we'll look at the global escalation that causes all of this and that threatens us with apocalypse and what the steps are to move towards peace, because the ideal climate movement is one against war and empire, and the fight against war and empire is the movement for the planet. And so one action that you can take initially is we recently released an open letter with, I think now it has over 60 signatories, organizational signatories, and thousands of individuals. And it's sort of a first step at inviting a lot more unity between climate movements and anti-war movements to sort of clarify where we are amidst a really shifting political climate, because we really need to grow the movement and we need to educate and we need to build and we need to activate. And so please also send this letter to climate organizations and also join us next week on Monday, where we'll sort of close out this webinar series by talking about sort of the thesis of War is Not Green and what an anti-militarist climate movement really looks like. And so with that, I will turn it back to Jody to introduce our first incredible speaker for the night.
Thank you, Erin. Aren't we lucky to have Aaron as our campaigner for War is Not Green? He's also our East Coast regional organizer and also works in anti-Zionist organizing in Jewish spaces, which is his community. So deeply grateful to have you, Aaron, and thank you for setting the tone of this webinar. I'm very excited to introduce, by the way, I'm Jody. I'm one of the co-founders of Code Pink. I forgot in the beginning. I'm excited to introduce you to Anlin Wang, who I've known for the last, I don't know, 4 years. Anlin is the organizer with DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, where he's been the China Working Group coordinator. And at Code Pink, we also have a campaign called China is Not Our Enemy, and he's been part of our community. He's based in Philadelphia, where he's also connected to our local Philly chapter and organizes with the DSA in Philly. And he's also a member of the Chow Collective, that is a brilliant group of young activists who help us all be smarter about China, which just to say before he starts, if you live in the United States, you are intentionally made dumb about China. And it's been fun to learn with Anlin and from Anlin over the last few years. So thanks for joining us to talk about China tonight, Anlin.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and thank you, Jody, and Aaron for that kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation as well, and most especially thank you for all the critical work that Code Pink has been doing in raising the cause of peace here in this country, where, of course, as we all know, it's badly needed. My name again is Anlin Wang. I'm based up here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And here I'm also part of the Philadelphia chapter of the DSA. And I got connected to Code Pink and Jody and Aaron first through the Code Pink China is Not Our Enemy campaign. So very grateful that campaign has been really doing incredible work in helping lead the cause of educating Americans to take a better understanding, a more serious and studious approach towards understanding China. Which feels especially important in this time. And what I'm going to talk about today is when I was first asked to come on, I was asked if I could talk about environmental policy in particular. And so I'm just going to just speak a little briefly about why it is I think that just a couple top line points of why I think we should care about environmental policy, and I'll connect it to the issue of denuclearization as well. But can I just ask here, growing up, who has heard of China being a major polluter? Cities unlivable to the point where smog covers the city pretty much 365 days of the year. Has anyone heard about that sort of thing going on in big cities like Beijing or anything like that?
We can raise our hands, right? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I asked that part because that's certainly what I remember growing up. Certainly what my parents told me too. My dad is from Beijing as well, and so that was pretty deeply etched into my memories about what China was like and when I visited China as a kid too. But these days, when I go back, it is not nearly the same thing. Half the time the skies are just outright clear. And that occurred in just the span of just a little over a decade. In other words, from the 90s to the 2000s, China really set as its policy priority in supporting economic development at all costs, including that of environmental degradation. But now in 2025, China leads the world in green energy development. It leads the world in reforestation. I'll just give a couple numbers here just to try and illustrate the point here. In 2022, China built more solar and wind energy capacity than the US has in its entire history. That was 2022. In 2023, they upped the ante. In 2023, China built more solar and wind energy capacity in 1 year than the entire planet has built in its entire history. That was 2023. Such that now by the end of 2024, China had around twice as much wind and solar energy capacity as the rest of the planet combined. Okay. But of course, that's just what's going on inside China. Why should we care as Americans? How does this impact us? Well, can I ask here for those on the West Coast, has anyone ever ridden the California high-speed rail line? The answer is no. It's a trick question. No one has because it's not built. And of course, we can straightforwardly point to Elon Musk as like a singular reason for why it doesn't exist yet. I think that's more or less true. But it's still the case that one of the big barriers to building high-speed rail, not just in California, but anywhere in the US, is just the enormous cost. So, for example, I'm calling from Philadelphia. Philadelphia is home to one of the most dangerous highways in the country, the Roosevelt Boulevard. There are accidents literally every single day and many deaths that occur in a year. It's a 15-mile stretch of road that is essential for connecting Northeast Philadelphia to the rest of the urban core of Philadelphia. All right, so in other words, it's an economic lifeline for the city. And for decades, because of how dangerous it is, people have asked the question, well, why can't we just build a subway? And indeed, many decades ago, the government, the city of Philadelphia did start building a subway. In fact, much of the tunnel, many of the miles of that tunnel has already been built. But why don't we have it today? Well, it's because the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority says it's too expensive. It costs $3 billion. It's $200 million a mile. Unaffordable. Sorry, $3 billion, too much money. As folks know, with like Elon Musk is worth like $400 billion and stuff like that, right? So I'm sure folks know, okay, of course we can theoretically afford it. But to bring this back to why you should care about environmental policy in China, how much does high-speed rail cost in China today? On average, per mile, around $2 million per mile. All right, so again, compare that $2 million per mile for high-speed rail in China with $200 a mile for just building some subway here in the US. Well, that's not just because of adjusted cost of living. That's because in China, there are literally hundreds of patents that just exist just for technology about how to reduce the cost and time it takes to build rail. Well, okay. $3 billion is too much money to build the Roosevelt Boulevard subway. What are we doing instead with that money? Does anyone want to take a guess as to how much money the US spends in a year on just maintaining its nuclear arsenal? Just 40 people on the call, so I'll just say the answer. It's around $120 billion a year.
Too much.
$120 billion per year for a nuclear arsenal. But as folks probably know, a nuclear arsenal is something that necessarily raises the risk of nuclear conflict. In other words, you can think about this in the reverse. It is probably the case that good environmental policy can reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. Climate change poses risk to food and water systems, limited resources across the world that are essential to human survival, human flourishing. The nuclear buildup directly threatens those very systems. I'll put this a different sort of way. The path that the United States is on right now, what's the path that the US is taking, right? Because we know that China has set a goal of hitting net zero emissions by 2060. It does appear that they are slightly ahead of pace of getting there. Where's the US heading? Well, folks may have seen the news that the US federal government has ended federal funding for climate research, environmental mitigation programs, pretty much across the board. At the same time, the US is engaging in a border militarization and brutalization policy. I don't know if folks saw, but last week the Trump administration declared they're going to reactivate the Roosevelt Reservation, which is a small strip of land that lasts for a couple hundred miles stretching from California through Arizona that basically turns a small section of the border into quote unquote military property, basically escalating the penalties for crossing it, as well as allowing for the installation of military troops there, of the U.S. military. So, in other words, the U.S. has functionally, officially, almost officially adopted a policy of accelerating climate change while also further militarizing and brutalizing its border. So it is almost literally the US directly implementing a fortress on the hill policy. And the way this ties back to nuclear weapons is, who are those nuclear weapons aimed at? Disproportionately China and Iran. And so what we want to do in the Democratic Socialists of America is shift US under the American understanding that actually climate cooperation benefits us. It's not just something that just saves the planet, and it's we're just doing it because we're bleeding heart. Like, you know, we just like things to be living for the sake of it. That's obviously a good enough reason on its own, but it also is something that directly benefits us. Instead of threatening to create nuclear winter, we have the possibility now of, maybe not those of this administration, but what we have the opportunity to do, we are in a fork in the road in this time with US policy. It's either climate cooperation or we further escalate the possibility of nuclear conflict as the US continues to escalate tensions with both China and Iran and threatens nuclear weapons as sort of its trump card in the comparison of military supremacy. So for that reason, very grateful to Code Pink here for taking such strong and consistent efforts to educate the public and continue advocating on the need to denuclearize and see cooperation instead of military confrontation with China. Thanks again, and thanks for the time. I can't say we're too long, but really appreciate you taking the time, letting me speak at all.
Anlin, you're such an amazing teacher. Thank you so much. So lovely to have you, and thanks for making us smarter and also just really articulating that so well in the wholeness of what we need to be investing in is the people. And it's that weapons don't make us more safe. Taking care of life is what makes us more safe in all the ways that we can do it. So thank you so much for that. On our last trip to China, we were actually in a city that wasn't using any fossil fuel in any of the vehicles that were operated by the city, and it's a huge city of like 30 million. It wasn't like some small town. So thank you for joining us and taking the time this afternoon. Next, I want to bring up one of my heroes, one of my most favorite people on the planet. I'll never forget being outside the White House and putting ourselves on the line to try to stop the war. And Anne Wright resigned from the State Department and wrote her letter, and it was in the New York Times. And I'm still nourished by that courage and letter to today. She's a retired U.S. Army colonel and, left the U.S. State Department because they weren't serving her values anymore, and by going to war on Iraq. And, this is also a woman who won an award for heroism in her role as a diplomat when she evacuated several thousand people from the civil war in Sierra Leone. Anne serves life, and Anne exposes the stupidity of the war machine with her life. And I just adore her. Thank you for joining us today, Anne, and for all you do for peace.
Well, thank you very much, Jody. It's been a real pleasure to be working with Code Pink since, in the early days after my resignation. I wasn't too sure where I was going to end up, having been in the government all my life and then suddenly not part of it. And then who do you work with? And these crazy women wearing pink, we're doing all these outrageous things. And I've slowly been able to kind of start keeping up with you all. So I'm trying. But today, what we're going to talk about, or what I'm going to talk about, is the nuclear programs that we have, the United States and Russia, the two nuclear powers that have the most nuclear weapons. The United States has 1,670 of them that are deployed right now. Russia has 1,710 that are deployed. Altogether, the United States has 5,227. I don't know where the rest of them are. If they're not deployed, where are they? That's one of the good questions to ask. And why are we spending these billions of dollars? And Anlin said 120 billion. There are other figures that are like 69 billion that we are spending each year on keeping these nuclear weapons ready to go. And all you really need is one, because one, if anybody fires off one, whoever else has them is going to start firing their stuff. So it'll only take one nuclear weapon to kill us all, really. With that, when we're talking about the new Cold War and the nuclear aspects of it, I'll talk about Russia, the other big nuclear power, and then the Iran, which is not a nuclear weapons power, but the Trump administration actually is starting to talk with them after, in 2018, Trump torpedoed the Obama nuclear deal that had been struck with the Iranians, and that was working. But let's go first to Russia and Ukraine, because that's the hot spot that's going on, a hot war that's going on in the Cold War. And there have been some steps that have been taken. There was a 30-day ceasefire that was brokered by the Trump administration. I mean, I'm not going to hand any kudos to the Trump administration, I'll tell you that. But the fact that Trump is speaking, or his envoy, Steve Witkoff, is speaking with the Russians, and we're able to get a 30-day ceasefire, which meant that they were not supposed to be blowing up each other's energy infrastructure, although that ceasefire really has not held. It was supposed to lead to a peace agreement. That is being discussed. In fact, Steve Witkoff was in Moscow last weekend, I think, well, maybe a little bit further behind that, and had a 5-hour conversation with Putin about a variety of things, to include a peace agreement. But the Russians come back now to say that there is no movement from their part on a peace agreement. And indeed, when you see the level of destruction that's going on, there are two major Russian bombs that hit Ukrainian cities, and 30 people were killed in one of them and 17 in another. So that they're still fighting. There's still killing going on. And as Code Pink Women for Peace and all of our other organizations, we want the killing to stop. The message that's coming out of these negotiations or discussions, actually, what is kind of interesting, as Jody mentioned, I spent 16 years in the U.S. State Department, and I'll just say that probably what my values are now certainly were not reflected in the 8 presidential administrations that I worked under, but I worked under them, finally resigning over them. But here you have Steve Witkoff, who is a brand new special envoy, big businessman, big billionaire, knows everything. So in his 5-hour conversation with Putin, he did not take any of the State Department experts on Russia in with him, who could have possibly advised him a little bit on the foreign policy of the Russian Federation, the history of the Soviet Union and Ukraine, and the history of all of it. He didn't take that in. And Trump says in other things that they get played a lot by other countries. Well, I think that probably Steve Witkoff in this case has been played a little bit by Putin, not to undercut the fact that there was at least this 30-day ceasefire, which is just about over and never really held. all of this to say that the use of nuclear weapons by tactical nuclear weapons, in particular by the Russian Federation, has certainly been talked about by Putin. So it is a conflict that I wish the Trump administration success in getting a peace agreement. Now, the peace agreement that the Russian Federation keeps saying that their negotiating points are very firm, and those are things that probably the Ukrainians are not going to go along with, because part of it is the recognition of Russia's sovereignty over 5 occupied regions that it has annexed illegally: Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and then the withdrawal of forces and ceding more territory to Russia, and Ukrainian neutrality and demilitarization. So those are things that I would suspect that there's got to be negotiations on all that. And we hope that the negotiations will end in a peace agreement that can hold, so that there will be no more killing of Ukrainians, of Russians, of North Koreans, of Chinese, or whoever else is involved in that. So that's a little update on what's been going on in Russia. And then interestingly enough, here you have the Trump administration that has sent its envoys to talk with the Iranian government, which is good. I mean, the Biden administration didn't talk to the Russian Federation. They didn't talk to the Islamic Republic of Iran. But now we have the Trump envoys that are talking with the Iranians. They were in Oman over last weekend, and then they're going to be meeting, it turns out, in Rome this coming weekend. And that is good. It's going to take a lot of negotiations to for the Iranians actually to feel comfortable with Trump, even though Trump, of course, is saying that if they don't come through with something fast, it's all hell's going to break loose again. But the fact that they are having discussions is very, very important. And the fact that the IAEA, the International Energy Association, is heading back into Iran this week to try to improve access of their inspectors to Tehran's program. Now, in the time that since the first Trump administration torpedoed the nuclear framework with Iran that had been negotiated under Obama, when Trump dumped it in 2018, the 2015 agreement said that, and Iran had agreed that they would only enrich uranium up to 3.67%, which was going to be for its nuclear power plant. Now, because here it is 10 years later, from 2015 to 2025, 10 years later, Iran has enriched some of its weapons grade materials up to 60%, which is a big increase and a cause of concern. Although the Islamic Republic maintains that they are not going to develop atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, but they're very, very close. They could, if they wanted to, develop them. And that's why it's so important now to have negotiations with the Iranians. It will be a long, tough road, and I hope that the Trump administration will hang in there and will not get flummoxed by not getting an immediate agreement. I don't think the Trump method of intimidation and bullying, which Trump is doing to universities and all sorts of other groups here in the United States, I don't think it's not going to work with China, and I don't think it's going to work with Iran. But for the safety and security of the world on the issue of nuclear weapons, we've got to really keep pushing and at least give credit for having these discussions start. Thank you very much.
Anne, thank you so much. Wow, that was a lot. Thank you for your intense research and being able to deliver that huge amount of information to us so quickly. Um, I just want to ask you one question as a diplomat, and then we can let you go. Um, this is almost 25 years ago when you decided to leave the State Department, and you were engaged in the foreign policy of the United States for a long time. What do you see differently? What concerns you? What is different? If you could just reflect, because we remember when we were young and we used to get under our desks I find that people aren't even taking the nuclear threat seriously. And I wonder, in your time, what do you see that is different and that might inform us right now?
Well, I think you're right that there are a lot of other issues that are higher up on people's agenda than the nuclear weapons issue, and it's to our own peril that we let it to be that way, and that we don't put pressure on our members of Congress to bring it up, to talk about it. Um, the whole issue of diplomacy is something that has changed and changed radically, really, in the last 3 months, with the exception, I would say, of the work with Iran and with Russia. Those are two good examples of diplomacy at work, where you're actually talking to people and trying to get killings to stop and don't let them start. But on the other side of it, you see that the State Department is probably going to be cut in half by its budget. It's the Trump administration saying they're going to close a large number of consulates around the world, which does not help U.S. interests in other lands. And what they're doing to international students is horrific as far as foreign policy is concerned. So we're really up a creek, with the exception, I think, of these discussions that are going on with Russia and with Iran. But we've got our role as citizen activists is to keep pushing, pushing, pushing wherever we can, write letters to the editor of your newspaper, online stuff, and certainly, as Americans are doing right now in the congressional recess, going to those town halls that the very few congressmen and women are having because they're getting their ass handed to them, my apologies, by the people of America who are outraged about what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, so much. And I think, one of the things, and I see it a little bit in the chat, is that when people are upset of no one doing anything to Israel, we have to remember Israel is a nuclear power and has nuclear weapons, and that the nuclearization of the world, where the nukes are on the side of Israel, is a very hard, it makes life difficult for anyone who wants to engage to stop the madness. And so it's the opposite of a deterrent right now. So thanks, Anne, for joining us. And I think as a lead off to that, Aaron, I'll let you introduce Henry, that leads right off of what Anne was saying. So thanks, Anne.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne. So clarifying and so grateful to have you here. Yeah, so next we're going to transition and keep the show moving to Henry, who just got on the call after a no war with Iran call. And so I think that is actually an incredible transition. But Henry is an incredible peace activist and writer who works with the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation, Rural Vermont, the Land and Leadership Initiative, and the Vermont Peace Anti-War Coalition. He's worked on municipal campaigns to divest from Israel's apartheid system. He helps rural Vermont connect Vermont's farmers with regional peace groups. And he's a part of Code Pink's China is Not Our Enemy and the Peace Clock campaigns, which we'll be talking a little bit about the framework of, and is researching and writing about how dangerous and unnecessary the US's imperialist approach to the world has been and continues to be. Take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. And yeah, as you said, I was just listening to Naveed Farnia talk about why Iran has been targeted for so long and the dangers there. And it does lead into the Peace Clock, which is an initiative we've been working on through the War is Not Green campaign with Code Pink. which gets at the necessity for sustainable peace. And when we hear the word sustainable, it's often in the green sense, but if there's going to be collaboration on green energy or agroecology or any of these things that can help us both with resilience and with dealing with the more literal changes of climate change, um, there's going to have to be collaboration, and uh, that will require a step back from this Cold War mindset. And the, the Cold War mindset is tied to obviously a kind of war economy and a perpetual war state, and a sustainable peace um, is one that looks at building something, a framework that addresses the security concerns of each country. And there are frameworks out there for that, and countries that are already putting forth proposals. China has put forth security frameworks and forums for dialogue, and other countries are trying to get involved with this. Um, but I think before I get to the peace clock and that more fully into that, um, I think it's interesting to look at how the opportunities for collaboration are really being presented already. And um, there's a sense that the among the people in the West that the new Cold War is between the West and the rest, or the global South, or um, and really, to me, it's more uh, the West and the neo-colonial Cold War mindset of the West versus an already emerging multipolar world, which is not opposed to the West joining it. And so the opportunities are already there for collaboration. And so I'm sure Anlin talked about how China is produces more green energy than all other countries combined, and how the tariffs and the war on Chinese scientists in the US has cut us off from collaborating with China on green energy. But there's also, if you look at Cuba, Nicaragua, China, Venezuela, a lot of these countries are also some of the best at agroecology, sustainable agriculture, uh, and Cuba is an example of a country that, with very low energy uh, production and availability, is able to generally, except when the sanctions are especially bad and times are especially bad, generally they run a very amazing country. I've been there, and Cuba is an example to the rest of the world of how to live with low energy availability. China is a totally different example, but still moving in the direction of sustainability. Nicaragua is one of the best in the world at agroecology, and all these countries collaborate already. And they're not opposed, most of them are not opposed to collaborating with the United States. Um, and China also collaborates with MST in Brazil, which has retaken enough land to feed a million people, and they have occupied this land, which used to be run by factory farmers, and they're now running through agroecology. So all these opportunities are available to us right now, and it's really crucial that we take advantage of it, because the climate crisis is worsening before our eyes. And so so that's the multipolar world that's available, and it doesn't exclude capitalist countries even. And some people are actually think that the multipolar world should be more confrontational towards capitalist countries, but the reality is that the opportunity for collaboration is already here. And so when it comes to the peace clock, this is a way to, I think, look towards integrating into a multipolar world in a more long-term sense. And when we talk about nuclear weapons, there's a sense that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And I've heard some folks talk about how if you um, if you build you know, frameworks for de-escalation like China and India have built, where they only fight with sticks. And so even when they went to war in 2020, it didn't escalate into all-out war. Um, China shoots people with water cannons instead of initiating all-out war. There are other examples out there for de-escalation. And then there are frameworks, as I said, that China and others are putting forward for forums that can integrate different countries' legitimate security interests so that conflicts like Ukraine don't happen. Um, and so all of these things, if we really participate in them, we can build a sustainable peace which enables the war industries to become very obviously unnecessary. And with enough education and with enough integration and participation um, in these forums and tactics that can de-escalate and also eventually really make clear that countries can trust each other, you can eventually move towards, this is long term, but you can move towards a world where the war industries become less and less appealing, less and less smart people want to join the war industries, and eventually there is a war academic complex which undergirds the knowledge of the military industrial complexes around the world. And once that knowledge complex starts breaking down long term, um, potentially we could get to a world without nuclear weapons. And that eliminates the chance of nuclear winter, which would lead to immediate crop failure all over the world. And so this is all linked to ecology. And yeah, thank you.
Henry, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for all your work. Thanks for your inspiration. And that vision is, I mean, I just want to say that felt so lovely. Um, given all the fear mongering that we live in, that you just can continue to plant those seeds of possibility because people live in the stupidity of an assumption that war is the answer and it never is. So just deepest gratitude for leading there. And just
Jody, thanks for inspiring us always.
all that you do. So our last guest is, the public intellectual of our time, Vijay Prashad, who is an author, a journalist, a political commentator, and a Marxist intellectual. And he's also the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and editor of Leftward Books. And he's written, dozens and dozens of books, and he's teaching nonstop with his life every day. And we said earlier the importance of just relearning in this time of toxic propaganda. And also, for me, Vijay is the tuning fork for the future because he owns it, he speaks it, he teaches us, he helps us uh, get out of the stupidity that has been this whole day, every day. And with his love, at the core, Vijay is love, and then what has always brought me to him, that at the core, Marxism is about love. And so, Vijay, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you. It's so nice to see you. I'm at the other end of the Americas, right down near the penguins, and I really, worry for all of you with the every day I sort of glance at the newspapers, wondering what is going to happen next, and it's a very strange situation. It's very difficult to really put it together. Anybody who claims to have a handle on the totality is really not grasping everything, because there's just too much happening, I think, in one respect. Um, but at the bottom of it, there's something pretty clear, which is, I think that the elites in the United States, the very top people have understood pretty clearly that, their problem is China. Um, in fact, I mean, I've talked about this before, and I want to introduce him to you again. One of the most important intellectuals in the Trump administration is Elbridge Colby. I think he's a really interesting person. I read a book he wrote, published by Yale University Press. Um, you know, he comes from the old New England elite. His grandfather was the head of the CIA, William Colby. Some of you may remember him from the 1980s, old Bill Colby. Elbridge goes by the name Bridge. Elbridge goes by the name Bridge, as you'd think, because he comes from that sort of background. But in fact, his entry and others as well, not just him, into the Trump administration is really significant because they have broken a consensus, which, I'm not unhappy that they've broken, to be honest with you. From the fall of the Soviet Union, the Clinton administration, till this Trump administration, basically US foreign policy was described, can be described as idealistic in the sense of US political science, which divides thinkers into idealists and realists. These were idealists who believed in the American ideals, and they thought that you could bomb countries and make great American democracies. You could do coup d'etats and create a great democracy. And you could actually make America in Iraq by using depleted uranium. On top of depleted uranium, you could build a great Jeffersonian democracy. I mean, these guys were nuts, including John Bolton, who is an idealist. He believes that you can just drop a bomb on Cuba, the communists will disappear. What he calls tyranny will end, and again, Jeffersonian democracy or whatever it is, Monrovian democracy will appear. This was the dominant strain of U.S. foreign policy. Now, Trump has brought a whole different bunch of people into the halls of power. These are realists, right-wing realists. Bridge Colby is a right-wing realist. What does that mean? You see, they've understood that Russia is not an existential threat to the US. Russia is basically an exporter of commodities. It's like a third world country. They export natural gas, they export oil, they export rare earth minerals, they export things like that. It's not a threat to the US. And Russia would never dare attack the United States. It would be obliterated. In the same way, one of the people who's entered the Trump administration with the Iran file believes that, as he told his nomination process, if the US, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, well, it's not a problem for the United States because Iran would never dare to even threaten the US. We could just wipe it off the map. So actually spending US assets to prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon is a waste of energy. He said that pretty directly. That's a right-wing realist. And in a sense, right-wing realists see the world for what it is, rather than have some fantasy about, laying a carpet of bombs and then building democracy on top of it. In that sense, they are more realistic. Anyway, Elbridge Colby says, well, Russia is not a threat. Iran is not a threat. The real threat to the United States is China. Now, if you look at it closely, he's of course correct. It is the real threat to China, but not the way they are selling it to the public. What's the threat that China poses? The proximate threat. The proximate threat is as a consequence of the US government's own policies over the last 30, 40 years. The Chinese have basically outproduced the United States, not in buckets and nails and things like that, but in high speed rail, in robotics, in telecommunications, and so on. Therefore, companies like Huawei can basically walk all over Apple. Anyway, Apple products are made in China, but they are producing far more sophisticated technology. So a key part of the US GDP is actually under threat from much better, much more efficient, much better Chinese companies. Now, okay, that's a problem for capitalism. So what should American capitalists do? Well, hey, Tim, what's his name? Tim Scott or whatever, Tim Scott. Why don't you use some of your money and Elon's money and invest in this damn project called the United States, this Jeffersonian democracy that you've hollowed out? Why don't you invest in it? Build a new port, build some high speed rail, build better phones and better No. These guys have lost the habit of taking their money and risking it in producing anything. They've lost that habit. They are not willing to do that. So rather than actually try to compete with China, rather than actually, sorry, I have a little beast that, rather than actually try to compete with China, to do, what capitalists are supposed to do, isn't that what we are often told? Is compete head on head, try to make better phones, make better robotics, and so on. What the US elites want is the US military to do their work for them. They would like the US military to intimidate China to the extent that the Chinese will surrender economically and give up to the United States. That's basically the new Cold War in China. That's how we at No Cold War see the situation. I actually agree with Elbridge Colby that it is true. Russia does not pose a threat to the United States. This war was insane. The war in Ukraine is insane. It should be shut down. I agree that, Ukraine is going to have to live next to Russia. That's just a fact. It's going to have to learn to deal with Russia. And maybe what Henry said is correct. Maybe they should learn to fight each other with sticks because they're going to have to be neighbors. You can't change that. That's a fact of geography, right? And history. They're going to have to come to terms with each other. But the Chinese are a genuine threat to the US billionaires, but not to you, not to the US public. Who's a threat to the US public is the people who've stolen your wealth and is refusing to invest it to make the United States, what is that line again? Make America great again. Well, what about building a new port or building a airfield somewhere where planes don't, what about building the infrastructure? There are times when I come to the United States and I say, what kind of infrastructure are people willing to live with? It's a lot like the Germans who are living with trains that are worse than the trains I grew up with in India. And I'm serious. Indian high-speed rail right now is far superior to German trains. German rail system has been eaten because they want to spend all their money on their military. Go ahead, guys. You want to destroy your countries? Go ahead and do it. That's a choice you're going to make. United States, the Acela is a disgrace. I mean, from Boston to Washington, D.C., actually, the train is not bad. The train can handle close to 200 kilometers an hour. It's not that bad. But the train cannot run at that speed because the rails are ancient. And the top speed is just above 100 kilometers an hour. Between Beijing and Shanghai, in fact, between Tianjin and Beijing, any of the cities, you're running at close to 300 kilometers an hour, 3 times the top speed of Excella. More than 3 times. And there's a train now 400 kilometers an hour, which is just going to wipe out any high-speed rail anywhere in the world. Indian High-speed rail is right now at 200 kilometers an hour, which is really very good. Very good trains. So infrastructure is dying. You can't expect capitalism to come back roaring into the United States if you don't fund education, if you don't fund healthcare, if your workers are unable to properly focus. Part of education we know is not just reading, writing, arithmetic. It's also just learning discipline and focus. If you don't have the capacity for that, if you don't have healthcare, your workers are healthy and so on, you don't have infrastructure, people can't get to work without being hassled and harassed. Yeah. I mean, who wants to get into your workplace already exhausted? Yeah, from the commute. I mean, who wants that? Fighting with other cars on the freeway and whatnot. Your productivity is extremely low as a consequence. This is not something that we are seeing right now in many parts of Asia. This is what the US will have to compete against. And the political leaders in the US are not being honest with the public. They are not honestly telling the public our real problem is that we are going to have a hard time pivoting to be a more productive society, to compete against the kind of firms that have emerged largely in Asia. They're just not being honest. Instead, they are saying, these people are dangerous, we need to bomb them. That is the insanity of the Cold War. That is the insanity. I mean, the Chinese government can say over and over again, listen, we don't want a war with you. And it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter. They have said over and over again, we don't want a war. We are not interested in a war. If I repeat that line to you today, if somebody outside the Code Pink circle listens to that, they will say he's an agent of the Chinese government. Why? Because he's saying the Chinese don't want a war. I mean, imagine how crazy this is, okay? I am ventriloquizing the Chinese government, which has openly said, many different officials, many occasions, said it in fact to the American officials directly. We don't want a war. Yeah, we don't want a war. Me saying that will get me the accusation of being somehow being paid by the Chinese to say that the Chinese don't want a war. And why should I get paid by the Chinese to say the Chinese don't want a war when the Chinese themselves are saying and are quite capable of saying they don't want a war? This is a little bit like the madness of the Australian government. Australia's largest two-way trading partner is China. That means the largest exports from Australia go to China, and Australia's largest imports come from China. That means China is actually doing a good, making a good profit trading both ways with Australia. I mean, it's actually Australia that is doing quite well in the bargain, but still, the Chinese are pretty happy to trade with Australia. Australian military vessels have joined with US military vessels to patrol the very sea lane upon which cargo vessels are bringing goods from China to Australia and taking goods from Australia to China. Why would the Chinese disrupt the trade route between China and Australia where they are actually quite happy to trade? Why does Australia need to patrol the trade route? I mean, it is so insane. I was in Australia recently. I asked people this, or I asked a man who teaches at the National Defense University. He worked for many years as military intelligence, one of the smartest analysts of Australian foreign policy. His name is Clinton Fernandez. If you read any of his books, you'll be dazzled by his work. Clinton directly said, it is madness. It is basically madness. There is no explanation. There is no explanation for the fact that the United States government believes that China wants to attack the US when last year almost 80% of annual military spending was spent by the NATO countries, 80%, okay, 80, in case you're slipping with my Indian accent. 80, not 18, 80% of world military spending was spent by the NATO plus powers, United States close to 60% of that, okay? China's military share of global military spending was 4%. The Chinese are not mad. They are not trying to start a war with the United States. They know that if they started a full-scale war, the US can obliterate any country on the planet. Yeah, they know that. The United States' comparative advantage is in its long-range missiles and medium-range missiles. Maybe you can't build a good smartphone, but you can certainly destroy a country anywhere in the planet. Yeah, that is true. Like that's the comparative advantage. David Ricardo, um, that's what the United States has become really good at, is the ability to destroy anything anywhere, to murder anybody anywhere. Okay, unless they don't want to find him. Excuse me, 10 years plus Bin Laden hiding in a Pakistani military town. My God. Okay, but here's the point I want to make. We in No Cold War, this little group of people from all around the world, from South Korea out to Chile, where I am, we have been focused in this last couple of months, like you, like our partners in Code Pink and others around the world. We have been focused in trying to do as much sane political education. Because one of the things, the most distressing things, one of the things about this Trump period has been that the entirety of the media has lost its head. All of it. They are just not doing the kind of sane political education they should be doing. It's just not doing it. I mean, I'm afraid to read the New York Times, partly because for a long time it's been just a ghastly newspaper, and the fact that it maligned the great Jody Evans and has done so several times is good enough reason to flush it down the toilet. Although that may not be great for the sewage systems, but still. At any rate, I was going to say burn it, but then I'm worried a lot of you are climate change activists and you won't like that. Swallow it. That's bad for your health. Try to get them not to print it, for God's sake. Yeah, horrible newspaper, but it's getting even worse. Why? Because this simple fact that I'm sharing with you, that Elbridge Colby is right. The United States elites see the Chinese economy as an existential threat to their endless profits. And they want the world's people to pay for that. They are willing to take us into a cataclysmic war to prevent China from making technological advances. They want China to surrender. And the Chinese have said unequivocally, we've been through 1 century of humiliation. We are not going to go through it again. You may have forgotten, some of you will remember, that after the Soviet Union collapsed, within a year and a half, the Russian people lost about a decade of life expectancy. It just plummeted after the Soviet Union collapsed and stayed down for 12, 15 years. Life expectancy collapsed. That was a decade of humiliation when Yeltsin was the president of Russia, a decade of humiliation for the Russian people. It's interesting, when Putin returns, look at the names of his political parties. My Country, United Russia, Patriotic Russia. It's all deeply about how Russia will not be humiliated again. This is why Putin has been able to have a large section of the public with him, regardless of what the New York Times says. Because he has appealed to this sentiment in Russia of patriotism against that decade of humiliation. These countries are not going to surrender to the United States as Japan did with its Plaza Accord and the reverse Plaza Accord 10 years later. Neither China nor Russia want to be humiliated. And so that puts the world in a difficult position. We at No Cold War are very worried about the state of conflict now. Hair trigger. It's a hair trigger situation. So anything we can do together, I think, would be more than welcome, to provide political education to say the problem isn't China, it's your own bloody billionaires.
Thank you, Vijay. Yes, we want to join with you. Thank you so much for making us smarter and for your ferocity and your truth. But yes, we do want to be joining with you more. We realize right now at Code Pink, at DSA, that all we need to be doing right now is educating. And that's why we're so happy you joined us today. And that's what we do every day at Code Pink, is how do we help people out of the depth of lies. And so thanks for that. And yes, I don't know, Anlin had to leave, but we're super excited to be joining with you more at No Cold War. And certainly deeply appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Vijay. Love you so much.
Thanks a lot. Take care of yourselves. And be careful. It's a madhouse out there.
We know, we see. So what a treat. We've had so many amazing guests today. Thank you for joining us, you beautiful peacemakers that, want to be smarter, want to share with others, want to collect this information. So I'm going to turn it back over to Erin with how we can engage. And we have one more week of Earth Month to come back with. So take it away, Erin. And thank you, Anne, and thank you, Henry. Thank you, Anlin, and thank you, Vijay, for being with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's been such an honor to have all the speakers. And I think what Vijay was like saying so incredibly well is, and giving sort of the thesis of the night in some ways, which is how when you try to build something on top of destruction and extraction and exploitation of natural resources, of people, of nations, and trying to stamp out any life making, that's not sustainable, and it's not going to work, and it's a degree of insanity and ridiculousness. And so I think, when building projects exist, like we've heard about, like in some of the previous webinars that Henry was mentioning, that Vijay was talking about, and the US tries to stamp it out, it's on its own detriment. And so I think that then puts so much on us in terms of what we need to build to move away from insanity towards sanity. And like we've been saying throughout the whole month, peace through liberation. And so some initial things coming up, of course, next Monday, you can join us for our last webinar, which will be about War is Not Green and liberating the Earth from empire. We then, and throughout this and throughout the weekend ahead of then, you can use our toolkits on our Earth Month page to get or to give resources and try to build the movement. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build the movement. We're trying to invite more unity between climate and anti-war movements. And so you can do that locally at any events, share our letter, do some education along with it, try to bring the anti-militarism and anti-imperialism and anti-war and sanity to the program of what it is to be a climate movement. And of course, in ways that don't co-opt, but in ways that are about bringing together and educating and building. And so you can check out all our resources online. Join us on next Monday. There's podcasts to listen to, there's reading, there's resources on our War is Not Green website where you can sort of learn more about all of the intersections of climate and militarism and continue to build, because we need to, and we need to have something amidst the insanity. So thank you so much. And like I've said, US out of everywhere, peace through liberation, we're doing it. War is Not Green.
We'll see you next week. We have another one to finish off our series. And please be inviting groups that you're engaged with that are engaged in climate change work. Talk to them about that they need to be adding war and militarism to what they're talking about as far as taking care of the earth. Because when we take care of the earth, we take care of the people and we create peace. It's a circle. It's all connected.
Absolutely. Have a great night, everyone.